Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. We're going to spend some time looking at a variety of different issues, so stay with us for these entire 2 hours. And I guess say congratulations to those who produced Black Panther, 192 million domestically, 169 million overseas. I guess I'm one of the few people in America that has not seen that movie. We went to see Samson with our Sunday school class, but maybe we'll see it later. But nevertheless, that's just one of those events that took place over the weekend. Of course, the All-Star game for NBA and a variety of other issues. But let me get into some topics before we get our first guest. Our first guest in just a few minutes will be Robert Brown. He serves as a regional field director for the John Birch Society, probably best known for a number of lectures he has given over the years on the Constitution, and one in particular that he's been giving quite regularly, Rein in Big Government with Article 6, not Article 5. So we'll be talking with him. Second hour today, we'll spend a little bit of time with our friend Robert Knight. He's a senior fellow with the American Civil Rights Union and also a columnist for the Washington Times. We'll talk about free money. We'll talk about voter rolls and a variety of other topics with him. So there's a lot to cover today, and each day I hope you'll join us on Point of View. Take the time to read some of the articles, and one of the articles I wanted to read from just for a moment has to do with the FBI, and it's from our friend John Fund, who used to be at the Wall Street Journal, now writes for National Review. And if you'd like to read it in its entirety, it's on our website, pointofview.net. And he says that end the 9/11 syndrome at the FBI. Terrible things happen. There's little accountability. And he's been saying that since we've now learned so much more about this Florida shooting, the school shooting, in which, let's be honest, the FBI has dropped the ball numerous times, is it time to really begin to get some accountability at the FBI? He points out, for example, Howard Finkelstein of Broward County, who's the public defender there, actually said that they had actually found, quote, this kid exhibited every single known red flag, from killing animals to having a cache of weapons to disruptive behavior to saying he wanted to be a school shooter. If this isn't a person who should have gotten someone's attention, I don't know who is. This is a multi-system failure. Now, of course, being the public defender, making a point for the fact that maybe the system let him down. Okay, maybe it did, but he's responsible. But let's just go back and remind ourselves of some of the failures. For example, the FBI admitted that they received at least 2 very significant tips on this individual. Last fall, as we talked about last week, you had a YouTube vlogger noticing, for example, one of his comments, "I'm going to be a professional school shooter," and, of course, was then interviewed. And, of course, the FBI went and interviewed the shooter as well. Then just 6 weeks ago, a person close to this individual warned a call taker on the FBI's tip line that the expelled student had a desire to kill and might attack a school. We can go through the long list here in the article, which, again, we've posted at our website, pointofview.net. And then John Fund says that for his part, the FBI director, Wray, is promising that his agency will conduct a full probe. But he also goes on to say congressional oversight committees are skeptical about how complete that will be, given the recent evidence of the FBI's politicized role in the probes of Russia and the Trump campaign, along with the infamous anti-Trump Steele dossier, which the FBI relied on without verifying. He goes on to say, of course, there should be a house cleaning at the FBI, but there's a larger issue. He says, I call it America's 9/11 syndrome. And, of course, he talks about being across the street from the World Trade Center when all those things happened and 2,600-plus people were killed. But then he points out that during the presidential campaign, his presidential campaign, Senator Rand Paul noted that the FBI had caught the 20th hijacker a month before his comrades launched their deadly carnage. The FBI agent who caught him wrote 70 letters to the FBI headquarters saying, we should look at this guy's computer, get a warrant. They never did. And the point is that this is a good example, I suspect, of a huge failure. If they had been more willing to surveil back then, would we have had a 9/11 carnage? We don't know. But anyway, he goes on to say near the end of his article that since 9/11, John Funn says, we have seen many tragic events fueled by bureaucratic bungling, followed by a complete lack of accountability. The cycle has repeated itself over and over. That's why he says I exploded last month when the immediate response of officials in Hawaii to a state employee who issued a ballistic missile alert was so blasé. The alert caused mass panic for nearly 40 minutes. The point at the time was the FEMA director there, or at least the emergency management person there, said we're not going to be point figures. So John Funn goes on to say, and I mentioned this the other day, but let's come back to it again. It was ultimately the Federal Communications Commission that forced Hawaii officials out of their lethargy. FCC investigators found that the employee, who had worked at the agency for more than 10 years, had a history of confusing drills and real-world events. On the day of the alert, he listened to only part of a drill recording and thought a real attack was occurring. The employee had made similar mistakes twice before. He was finally fired, still with no identification by name, and the director of emergency management, well, conveniently retired. And the point he's making is, here's a good example of nobody's ever held to account. You might remember just a few weeks ago, I pointed out that indeed it was bad enough that this was a false alarm, but at first we were told that the false alarm because somebody pushed the wrong button. Well, it was worse. He pushed the button because he was convinced it was an absolute attack, and this was, according to this, the third time that he had made that kind of mistake, and still he was in his job, and apparently were no repercussions. So you can see that sometimes the bureaucracies protect their own. And if you see what happened there in Hawaii with this false alarm, I think what John Funn is saying is maybe it's time to begin to clean house at the FBI. And again, this is not to say get rid of all 36,000 FBI agents. Some, and as a matter of fact, let's say most, the vast majority of them are honorable individuals that are doing the right thing. But sometimes what happens is a small fry is removed, but the people higher up that are making some of those mistakes, they never actually have to be held accountable. So I wanted to post that article for you to look at today because it relates very much to the school shooting. Later on, maybe in the second hour, we'll get into something else because Donald Trump has talked about the fact that he's at least open to, and I think reasonably so, looking at improving some of these background checks. There is a piece of legislation being proposed by Senator John Cornyn of Texas, who's a Republican, and Senator Chris Murphy, a Democrat from Connecticut. So we'll get into some of that. And are there some good common sense kinds of gun reform laws that make some sense? And those have been proposed in many cases by bipartisan individuals. So we'll get into that a little bit later. But when we come back, I want to talk a little bit about how to rein in an out-of-control government using one of the articles we rarely talk about in the Constitution. It's called Article 6. So we're going to be talking with Robert Brown. He's with the John Birch Society and, of course, an individual that writes for the New American. So we'll join with him, get some constitutional education, and, of course, we'll take your phone calls. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Often I say on radio that the youngest generation is the most pro-life generation in history. A recent Quinnipiac poll bears this out. It found that 18 to 34-year-olds were more likely than any other age demographic to support a ban on abortions after 20 weeks. As I mentioned in a previous commentary, that is what a bill in Congress would accomplish if it could pass the U.S. Senate. In a recent Washington Post blog, Eugene Scott also argues that this polling illustrates that even after 45 years of legalized abortion because of the Supreme Court decision of Roe v. Wade, the culture battle over abortion is not over. This is surely not what the Abortion Rights Action League or Planned Parenthood expected. They would have expected that a generation growing up where abortion is always legal would want to continue keeping abortion legal. In the 1970s and 1980s, polling showed a significant generation gap. Older voters opposed legalized abortion while younger voters supported abortion rights. That has changed over time. Sonograms have provided a window on the womb, and millennials realize that their parents and their peers have been aborting their fellow classmates and even their possible brothers and sisters. Michael New, writing in the National Review, also has found polling data that illustrates the shift. He says the most compelling evidence comes from the General Social Survey. It asked the same 6 questions on abortion since the early 1970s. They range from whether abortion should be legal for a woman who is raped to whether a married woman should be allowed to get an abortion merely because she does not want more children. Starting around 2000, there is a significant shift in attitude among young adults. They are much more likely to identify with a pro-life position, although they might be a bit more reluctant to identify as pro-life. Nevertheless, this is a remarkable shift in values on the issue of life. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From PureFlix, the biblical story of the last of the Hebrew judges, Samson. Rated PG-13. Samson, now playing. Information at samson.movie.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Now we're going to spend some time educating you about the Constitution, so sit back, take some notes, and at the same time also talking about how we might have a solution within the Constitution to begin to deal with this out-of-control government. And so we bring to the microphone Robert Brown, who is a regional field director for the John Birch Society, also a writer for the New American. He has produced a number of lectures which are available called The Constitution is the Solution, but lately has been giving a talk that a lot of people have been talking about. You can, of course, find out more about that by going to various YouTube channels and other links. Rein in Big Government with Article 6, not 5. And Robert, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, thank you for having me.
You know, we try to educate people here about the Constitution, but as somebody that has been face-to-face with lots of audiences over the last couple of months and years, you'd have to agree with me that we have a high level of constitutional illiteracy, don't we?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, as I'm on the speech tour presently, one of the things that is included in my presentation is a 10-question quiz on the Constitution.
Yes.
And keep in mind, the audience I'm speaking to are generally the political activists, the ones that are very constitutionally minded. And even with that in mind, they always agree, gee, I really just don't know the Constitution as well as I should once they've gone through the course and through the quiz. So even those that should know it, that are active, don't know it well. But then we get out to the general population, I would say that everyone estimates the average score on this quiz, if we went out to the downtown, would be a 0 out of 10. Virtually nobody would get a single answer right. And these are key provisions of the Constitution that are included in the quiz. These are not just obscure trivia.
And again,
really
I would love to have you give that quiz to some members of Congress, because I wonder how some of them would do as well.
I think I know already.
I think we know. Okay, well, let's get into this because, some of our listeners might know a little bit about Article 1, 2, and 3. They may have heard a little bit about Article 5 because we've occasionally done something like that. But when we get to Article 6, I would have to say that unless somebody has just heard your lecture or maybe just took a class in constitutional law, I'm not even sure then, they would know what Article 6 is. But the framers really have, and the founders gave us a way to actually rein in this completely out-of-control government. So educate us, if you might.
Absolutely. And one of the things I'm doing is I'm combating against the misinformation that's being spread around the country right now, because we're clearly off course for one specific reason. I always say that they in Washington, D.C., don't play by the rules simply because we, the people, don't know the rules. And so in order to cure that, we need to start back to constitutional enforcement. This is where Article 6 comes in. Article 6, Clauses 2 and 3. We'll start with Clause 3. That's the Oath of Office Clause.
Right.
That's where it requires everyone, federal, state, local, elected, appointed, military, sheriffs, police, everybody has to swear an oath to uphold the federal Constitution. And in Federalist 44, Madison addresses the question, why? Why do our state-level officials, governors, state legislators, have to swear an oath to the federal Constitution? What does it have to do with them? His answer was brilliant. He says very simply, it becomes their duty to give effect to the Constitution. They're the enforcement power. They're one of the enforcement arms of the Constitution. And that's really what this article solution comes down to, is constitutional enforcement. There are those that are talking about we need to change the Constitution back on track, but my assertion is that it isn't because of the Constitution that we're off track. It's because we're ignoring it. We don't need to change it. We need to obey it. We need to follow it. We need to enforce it. And take, for example, the balanced budget amendment that's being pushed around. The Constitution, as it now stands, is a better solution than any balanced budget amendment I've seen. The reason I say that is, how much of the federal spending is authorized by the Constitution? And most expert analysis on that is right around 20%. So if you were to trim the federal government back to what is actually authorized by the Constitution, you'd have an excess of about $2 trillion annually, that much of a surplus, instead of having deficit spending all the time. We would begin paying off the national debt. It'd greatly restrict federal power and federal jurisdiction. And so that gives us a bit of a test of how far off track we really are from what the Constitution actually says. 20% of everything they're doing is actually authorized.
And I think, again, many of our listeners would know that. We've had many people on here that talk about the fact that so much of what the federal government is doing was never anticipated, which brings us back to the oath, which is part of Article 6. And that is, people say, well, why is it that important for people in the states? Well, there used to be a time, and I think still we teach this in the classes sometimes, that certain powers, enumerated powers, were delegated to the federal government, but the rest were reserved to the states and the people. So the states were supposed to be much more powerful. Up until a century ago, the senators came from the state legislatures and things of that nature. The states held the government in check. But that starts getting us into the other aspect of this, of checks and balances. If there's one thing that maybe some of our listeners would know if they read Federalist Paper 10 or Federalist Paper 51, is that there were supposed to be checks and balances, and we're not holding the federal government in check. So talk about how Article 6 helps us there.
Absolutely. And there are really two different avenues that I would point to. There's the defensive line and the offensive line. Now, on the defensive line, you have the states. And one of the most common themes we see throughout the Federalist Papers is the theme of state nullification, that if the federal government ever oversteps its bounds, this is found, for example, Federalist 16, 26, 33, 44, 46, and 48. I'll talk about this topic of the states drawing a line in the sand saying, we're not going to help implement unconstitutional actions. For example, Hamilton, Federalist 16, says if the cooperation of the state legislatures is necessary to implement a federal law, they have only not to act or to act evasively, and that measure is defeated. And that accounts for a majority of unconstitutional federal programs we're facing today. The states merely need to just say, no, we're not going to help you do this, and that would defeat them. So that's the defensive line, is the states standing up saying nullification type of action, we're not going to help participate in unconstitutional action. The offensive line is even more powerful, And that is through Congress, through we the people influencing Congress directly. One of the presentations I give on that topic, which can be found on YouTube, is called The Power of 500, where in any congressional district, you pull together a team of a few hundred people working in a coordinated effort. We've demonstrated that can be enough political pressure for that congressman to begin following the Constitution much more strictly. That's something I did in my home state of Montana just a few years ago, where we took my congressman who was following the Constitution about half the time, and within a matter of just a few months, he was following it right around 90% of the time, and we almost had him perfected before he moved on to his next office. And then we have to start again with the next congressman. But that's really the offensive and defensive lines of constitutional enforcement. The other thing that I often have people point to, though, is, well, what about the Supremacy Clause, Article 6, Clause 2?
Yes.
Constitutional enforcement, nullification, doesn't that violate the Supremacy Clause? Well, no, not if you read it properly. If you read, for example, what it says is that the Constitution and the laws of the United States, which are made in pursuance thereof, made in following the Constitution, are supreme. Now, of this, Hamilton in Federalist 33 began to explain this. But what does that mean about laws that are made that are not in following the Constitution? His words on that are just beautiful. He says these will be merely acts of usurpation and will deserve to be treated as such. Those that are not made in following the Constitution are not laws at all. They have no authority. And Hamilton, of all people, Hamilton being the big government advocate among our founding fathers,
yes,
himself was even advocating the states need to treat unconstitutional law as an act of usurpation. And so the Supremacy Clause, properly understood, properly enforced, means that only federal law made in following the enumerated powers of Congress is a law at all. That's the Article 6 definition. Obey the oath of office, enforce laws which are constitutionally authorized, and nothing more. And that's the theme we see again and again. When the federal government steps over the bounds of the Constitution, the Founding Fathers again and again said constitutional enforcement is the tool. You know what they didn't say, though? They never said, when the federal government ignores the Constitution, you need to change the Constitution, through Article 5, for example. And that's the main differentiation I'm making as I travel the country. Article 5, they said, was for correcting errors in the Constitution. So if it was errors in the Constitution that are causing our problems, sure, that's what it's for. But that's not what I see in our nation today. I don't see errors in the Constitution causing these problems. It's just simply ignoring the Constitution is the real problem.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, let's give you a chance to join our conversation. First of all, we have a link to this article that kind of summarizes Article 6, a little bit about Article 5, then gives you an overview, and then even some suggested books and other resources. And again, you can go to jbs.org, but we have a link there as well so that you can find out a little bit more about what we're talking about today in terms of Article 6. But let me open up the phones. Many of you, of course, have expressed your concern about an out-of-control government. What about this idea of nullification? What about this idea of checks and balances? What could be happening at the state level to provide some of those checks? So again, let's open up the phones and give you a chance to ask some questions. Robert Brown with us, and again, we will give you that chance right after these messages.
From PureFlix comes Samson, the biblical story of the last of the Hebrew judges. From his anointing to betrayal to redemption.
My name is Samson, and you will face the wrath of God.
Samson, rated PG-13. May be inappropriate for children under 13. Now playing. More information is available at samson.movie.
Missing a day of Point of View is like Samson losing his hair. Now stay with me. Without his hair, Samson was weak, and ultimately he lost his sight. Without Point of View, you miss out on encouraging news, stories of how God is using Christians to make a difference. Instead of being strengthened, you get discouraged. And Point of View helps you see places to get involved, opportunities to apply your God-given gifts for good. Never miss a program, a Viewpoints commentary, an important action item when you download the Point of View radio app, free from Google Play or iTunes. Take out your phone right now and download the Point of View radio app. See the difference you can make.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Got a number of calls coming in. We'll get to those in just a minute. But, Robert, let me also mention that the article we have here, which is available through jbs.org, is a good summary, and it also mentions some books on nullification, a number of articles that have appeared in the New American about some attempts in the various state legislatures for nullification. But one of the questions that oftentimes comes up is, well, okay, if a state decides to nullify something, let's take, say, the state of Alabama decides that we're not going to accept the Supreme Court decision on same-sex marriage, and we won't issue same-sex marriage licenses because, after all, you are entering into an area that is not constitutionally mandated. How's that working out for those various states that take a stand like that?
It depends on how strong of a stand they take and how many states take that stand. Two examples of this would be the Real ID Act of 2005.
Right, there's a good example.
And then we also have the medicinal marijuana topic, both of which were issues where the federal government had clearly overstepped its bounds. And in both cases, multiple states stood up and said no to the unconstitutional actions of the federal government. When you have multiple states standing together, that is a force that the federal government will not push, will not win if they do push it too far. So the Real ID Act is a great example because from 2005 till now, it's never fully been implemented. The majority of states are not in compliance with the Real ID Act because it just said no, and the federal government continually pushes back the implementation deadline. In fact, the last one I saw was supposed to be January 18th. I live in a state that's non-compliant, and yet I'm still able to fly on the airline. They keep saying every couple of years they push the date back again, and they push the date back again, they push the date back again, hoping they can pressure the states into finally complying. But until they do, the federal government really has nothing they can do about it because the states really have the upper hand there. And so when they do make the stand like that, especially standing together, that's the powerful position. On the contrary, Utah stood alone opposing the No Child Left Behind Act, and then they quickly were bullied into submission because they were the only state.
Right.
So that's one key provision there is that states standing together, having interstate correlation on making a nullification stand is the much more powerful way to do it.
Again, why you should pay attention to who you're electing, for example, as your state attorney general and your governor and who you would elect to some of those legislators. Very important. That's why I thought this would be a very important topic for you to hear. And again, we have information about him and this article and a variety of others. And let's take some phone calls, 1-800-351-1212. You can not only listen to this online and watch it online, you can also go to Facebook Live. And apparently Barbara actually watches us on Facebook and is in the state of Texas. Barbara, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much. Robert Brown, this is your friend Barbara Harless.
Well, hello. Good to hear from you.
Hey, good to hear from you, too. I would like to hear your response because, of course, you know, I'm working the battle here on the ground in Texas, and we kind of lost one of the legs in our battle last session down in the Texas legislature. And so we have a lot of people who have good intentions, and they think and they know that the government, the federal government, is running away with their powers. And the saying that they tell me all the time at the end of the debate when they feel like they're losing ground, they say, well, Barbara, you know, you just want to sit around and do nothing. You know, at least we're doing something. And I respond and I say, well, we didn't get here overnight, and education is the key. But how would you expound on responding to that accusation? Well, you just want to sit around and do nothing, where we want to do something. We want to amend the Constitution and try to address this.
Right. And I think the first half of this radio show, we've already covered in quite a good detail that we are clearly pushing for action on the part of the states and on the part of the people to enforce the Constitution. There's a great quote from Henry Ford, of all people. I'm sorry, not from Henry Ford. This is from, I forget who it was from now, who said that the strength of the Constitution lies in the will of the people to defend it. And that's the real issue here. We, the people, have to be willing to defend the Constitution. But it takes, as Barbara's saying, education. We have to understand the Constitution. One of the first things I tell people they need to do is let's learn the Constitution. That's why I created the course, The Constitution is the Solution. That is designed to be an introduction to the Constitution to help an activist know what they need to know in order to defend the Constitution. Yet, on the contrary, in a state of, as we began talking about, rampant constitutional ignorance, which is where we are today, what kinds of amendments can we expect to happen? When people don't know the Constitution they're cutting into, they're likely to do damage. We have a great case in point on this, where a year and a half ago, September of 2016, the Convention of States organization held a mock convention, a practice run, where state legislators came from all over the country to gather for a few days and propose amendments to the Constitution, just as a role play, really. And the types of amendments they came up with a 96% Republican delegation, were rather shocking to me as a constitutional scholar. For example, one of them suggests that federal law can be issued by Congress, the president, or administrative agencies, which should be a huge red flag to any constitutionally minded person.
That's kind of why we were talking about education, right? And that's why we do this show, because
absolutely.
Even people that are serving in the legislatures sometimes haven't thought through the logical implications, and that's why you want to make sure that if you do have a constitutional convention, you have the kind of delegates that gathered together in 1787, right?
Which may be hard to find. That's one of my concerns.
Yes.
For my home state of Montana, I really don't trust our state legislature to select good constitutional scholar-minded people to be the delegates for our convention. And so I don't have any faith that we would have people that really understand what they're cutting into at that convention. And it's just like the convention we had, the mock convention back in September 2016. The amendment proposals they came up with would do tremendous damage to what we already have in the Constitution, and they didn't really realize that. They didn't realize the damage they were doing in the process. I think they were very well-intentioned. The constitutional ignorance, based upon that, building changes to the Constitution, I compare to inviting your grocery store clerk to do heart surgery. It's a crazy idea. How about we become thoroughly familiar with what we already have first before suggesting any changes to the Constitution? Because mostly the proposals they're suggesting are already solved if we just enforce what it already says.
Yes. And again, I think that was Albert Einstein, but again, the willingness to defend the Constitution. Let me take Missouri, KCMH. Dave, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, thanks for taking my call. The Bible says you can't serve two masters at the same time. So how can the First Amendment protect all conflicting religions at the same time? I thought the First Amendment was written to protect the Ten Commandments, which is the foundation of our civil law.
Any thoughts about that, Robert?
That's an interesting point. And really the guidance comes in when my rights end where your rights begin. I have a right to whatever religious freedoms, whatever religious beliefs I want, as long as it's not going to be imposed upon or forced upon anyone else, something that infringes upon their rights. And that's really what the founders had in mind, was that everyone should be free to have religious views or not, as much as they don't infringe upon other people's rights.
Good point. Let's see if we can maybe take one more. Kurt in Texas, listening on the internet. Kurt, what would you add to our conversation?
Well, hi. My concern is, as I look at history, back in 1787, they thought they were going to have a limited convention, and they thought that the ratification process was going to be the ratification process that they had in place, which was 100% of the states. And when the convention met, even though they were all instructed to be a limited convention, they went ahead and rewrote the whole thing. And when they did, they also changed the ratification process. And that is, I'm just saying that really scares me, would be that if these people met in this convention, they would then say, let's do a rewrite of the whole thing. And by the way, let's have a nationwide popular vote with the federal government running this thing on the internet. I don't know how far-fetched that is, but that, to me, that scares me.
Yeah, and again, I think Michael Ferris has talked about the fact they would still have to find 38 states to do that and changing the process. But again, that's one of the other arguments that people have raised over the years. But Robert, let me give you a chance to talk about how people can educate themselves. And if they'd like to have you come and speak, you are traveling around. And if people would like to hear the entire presentation and schedule it, how can they do so?
The best way is to contact the John Birch Society directly, 1-800-JBS-USA-1, and they schedule all my speaking engagements all around the country through there. But, yeah, the best way to do this is to begin to know the Constitution. I recommend you can pull up on YouTube, for example, the Constitution is the Solution videos is a great place to begin. We talk about the difference between democracy and republic, which is an important foundational issue. We need to learn the Constitution, and then we can help defend it. That's really what it comes down to.
Appreciate you joining us today. And again, all that information at the website, pointofview.net. We'll be back right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Tucked away in the corner of the United States Constitution is an important phrase that demonstrates our country's commitment to religious liberty. Toward the end of the main part of the Constitution, we find Article 6 dealing mostly with debts and the supremacy of treaties, but in the final paragraph, the framers prohibited any, quote, religious test for constitutional officers. Perhaps the most interesting thing about this religious test clause is that it has been entirely self-executing, probably because no religious test has actually been presented to any federal office holder. But the framers had at least two concerns about religious tests. First, if permitted, could religious tests be used by religious groups to exclude individuals from other religions? And, equally important, the framers recognized that a religious test could keep good and wise but secular citizens from achieving office. The framers of the Constitution sought a government officially neutral toward religion, one neither hostile toward nor sympathetic of the religious beliefs of its federal officers. Inherently, this recognizes the outer limits of government, that government's job is to govern rather than demand its people practice religion in the manner prescribed by Congress. In this way, somewhat unique in history, the United States became a government that permitted its people to pursue their relationship with the divine without pressure or punishment by their government. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let me again point you to this very good kind of summary article. Deals with Article 6 and a solution really given to us in the Constitution to begin to deal with an out-of-control government. And so if you'd like to know a little bit more about that, you can go to the website or go to jbs.org. And let's take some more phone calls because a number of you still have comments. So we'll go to Texas, KCTA. Susan, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yes, hello. I had a thought when I heard about Nicholas Cruz and the tragedy in Florida, which was just terrible. But then following that, prior to that, actually, the sheriff had announced that he had lots of problems, and the family members and neighbors knew about them and knew that he was seeing a doctor. And I was wondering why everyone then started being upset with the FBI for not being able to track the education and mental health of these people's child. And so I thought, well, why is that their job? I looked in Article 1, Section 8, and I couldn't find anywhere where the civil government is supposed to educate and track the mental health of our children.
Very true.
I kind of thought that was the parents and their physician.
And here's a couple of thoughts. In other words, when the
is-
FBI is brought in, okay, and it does have authority, there are times when, let's go back to the example I used a few minutes ago with John Fund, we can get a warrant to actually look at the computer, but they did not, of the 20th hijacker. If they had, they might have picked out the fact that there was a 9/11 about ready to happen. When you get verifiable evidence, actionable action, then you could still have to go through a court of law to do so. But back to the point that you're making, I don't think all of that should be laid at the feet of the FBI. One of the things they've talked about is whether or not you could get a restraining order. And anybody that's ever been around, and I've had, sadly, personal experience, both with an extended family member and another family member, of those who might be dangerous if they had access to a weapon, then either using due process, or if in one case you're the father or mother or younger child of a grandfather or something like that, you could take some action. But I agree with you. I think this is not an either or. When there is a potential threat to life, liberty, and property, that's a place where government steps in. But in other cases, it is the role of the family or the community to deal with that issue. So, I appreciate you raising that question. I don't blame the FBI for everything that happened. They can't actually even legally track all of that because we have all sorts of HIPAA rules and things like that that would prevent it. But at the same time, when we have actionable intelligence, I think we act upon it. What's your thoughts?
I thought it didn't work very well because it probably wasn't their job. I couldn't find it. Okay, well, thank you so much.
I think you've raised a very good question. It wasn't their job, but when you have a tip of any sort, whether it's an individual that may be engaged in a mass shooting or maybe a terrorist act, well, then the FBI or other groups, Homeland Security, then they have, I think, legitimate justification to protect us. But that's a good point. I really appreciate you bringing that up. Let's go to Arkansas, listening on the Internet. Tony, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Well, I'd like to chime in where Robert was going. Most of the people, they've never even read the Constitution. You can't get them to read it. They don't want to know it. And most of them don't even understand their rights under God, which is my rights, including immunities and privileges. The privileges are granted to me by God and can only be erased by God. My immunities are granted to me by God and only can be erased by God. And so you see a bunch of people coming in, and they've never even read law because they don't even know what the law of nations is. And it's enumerated in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 10. And that's the textbook, a 4-volume textbook that they use to actually write the U.S. Constitution. They don't have the slightest idea about it.
I know.
They could care less about learning it.
When I went to graduate school, we were required to read the Federalist Papers, and I have to admit that even though I had taken classes in government as an undergraduate, that was the first time that I really had to delve into it. And, of course, a lot of it, Tony, as I'm picking up from you, probably was self-study. And it helps you understand what a unique set of circumstances we had in the 18th century. These were people that had read Locke and Montesquieu. They were familiar with Blackstone's commentaries. They were familiar with the Roman law. They were familiar with, of course, biblical principles. And they brought so much to the table that today I'm not even sure PhD students in government at maybe even at a Christian university bring to the table. And so, again, this is, I think, the sad commentary of how today we don't have an understanding of the role of government from a biblical point of view and even from a legal point of view. And this is why, of course, you heard Robert suggest that maybe pulling together a constitutional convention of constitutionally illiterate people wouldn't turn out so well.
Well, yeah. I mean, literally, it would just be a disaster. And I've even read some of these proposals. It's just ridiculous. I mean, they're wanting to have a balanced budget amendment. The budget's not even in the Constitution. You're not supposed to hand that over to the president. Congress pays bills, taxes, and borrows money, and that's it.
Yep. Well, again, let's, if we ever did have a constitutional convention, and of course it's moving at a glacial rate anyway, but if we did, let's hope that, you have a lot more Michael Ferrises and Mark Levins and people like that, Ted Cruz's, and, go down the long list. But sadly, we do not have a constitutionally literate public, and so that's one of the reasons why we like to, from time to time, talk about some of these constitutional issues. And again, if you'd like to know a little bit more, we've posted quite a number of articles. If I can sound slightly self-serving, can I also recommend my latest book, Christians and Government, because this is a book that I put together, or I pulled together a lot of radio programs over the years that I thought would be helpful to individuals to try to understand that. We talk about some of the Christian principles related to government, some of the foundational principles on the Christian roots of the Declaration, the Christian roots of the Constitution, what is actually in each one of the Bill of Rights, where does that come from? A whole section on the Federalist Papers, some of the most important Federalist Papers that we mentioned. Then the whole issue of church and state. What about this concept of separation of church and state and all of that? And then a whole section that I've put together on political discourse, how to relate to issues ranging from politics and religion to civil disobedience. And then finally, a little bit on our Christian heritage as well. Some of the information about a one nation under God and a variety of other issues. So it is a book that I put together simply to pull together some of these principles that I think we all need to learn. And we're all in the process of learning. So I hope that you will listen to Point of View every single day so that we can educate you about these issues. In the second hour today, we're going to be talking with our friend Robert Knight, who writes for the Washington Times. Got a couple pieces here. Free money and pigeons. He's talking about what's happening there in Stockton, California. Some of our listeners out in California will appreciate that. His latest column that came out today, Taxing America Out of Its Liberties, when we, of course, spend more money than we take in. And I also want to get his comments about the attempt to clean up the voter rolls, because they have a very important case out of Ohio that went to the Supreme Court. So all of that is going to be covered in the second hour. Also talk about some of these gun reform laws. We were sort of getting into a little bit of that with Susan, but we have to take a break. So we'll come back and talk about some of those laws, some of those opportunities, and then we'll spend some time with Robert Knight talking about everything from what is happening at the governmental level, what is happening in the Supreme Court, and whether or not we can clean up these voter rolls. 248 counties have more people registered to vote than we have people of voting age in them. That's a chance for too much mischief. Let's clean those up. I'll be back right after this.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. A little bit later this hour, we're going to be talking with our friend Robert Knight, Senior Fellow for the American Civil Rights Union and also a regular columnist for the Washington Times. I've posted one of his columns, Free Money and Pigeons. We're going to post another one, Taxing America Out of Its Liberties, and also maybe talk to him about cleaning up the voter rolls, so that will certainly take a better part of the rest of our hour. But before we do so, I want to come back to a topic that I mentioned briefly, and Susan, who called in, was talking about, after Florida, well, what about the FBI? I'd opened the show, if you weren't listening in the first hour, about the fact that John Fund, in an article we've posted on our website, pointofview.net, has really called for the FBI to have greater accountability. And they have many times missed very obvious clues. And in this case, in Parkland, Florida, that is certainly one of those. So that is one part of that. We also see that Parkland students are going to march on the Florida Capitol. They're in Tallahassee, Florida, to demand changes in gun laws. And over the next couple of days, we're going to hear all sorts of people suggesting various kinds of gun law reform. I want to give you a few suggestions, but at least eliminate some that probably are not going to work. One of those is, again, we're going to hear for a ban on assault weapons. And, of course, that has been something that has been tried before and has not been very successful. The article we posted by David French on Friday has a very good link, if you will, to follow, where there was a question that was raised as to whether or not new gun laws would actually prevent any of these recent mass shootings. And, again, the link which you can follow and find for yourself is in the Washington Post. And it was done by Glenn Kessler, who's hardly, a real Second Amendment advocate, not exactly an NRA apologist, but basically concluded that it wouldn't have, these new laws being proposed, wouldn't have prevented any mass shootings. And even if you could get another assault weapons ban, how you define what an assault weapon is, anything with a magazine, well, that's a lot more than an AR-15. It's AKs, and it's all sorts of even hunting rifles and things of that nature. What it tended to do is increase the value of those, and those of us that might have a Sparrow and might say, okay, we'll make some money on this because it will give us appreciating assets, but will it stop any of the shootings? And it won't, but nevertheless, that's one of those. And with 300 million guns in the hands of Americans right now, do we really think, even if we stop manufacturing any of them tomorrow and prevented the manufacture, distribution, and sale of any of those, that wouldn't be possible, that individuals will still be able to get control of some of those? So that's one of those issues. The idea of doing any kind of background checks might work. And again, that's one suggestion that has actually been something that Donald Trump has talked about. First hour, I talked about the fact that he is open to at least improving background checks on gun purchases. And there was a very good article in the Federalist, and I've done a commentary that will come out next week on that. If you look at the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, we are supposed to have 3 databases in that system. And yet we see that not everything is being reported to the system. And a good example of that is, you might remember the man who killed more than 24 people in the First Baptist Church in Sutherland Springs, Texas. We found out after the fact that the Air Force had failed to report important information. So there's been legislation that has been proposed in the past, but not actually passed. In other words, it's been proposed, but it hasn't been enacted upon. So maybe that could be an attempt to deal with what I think is a very real problem of inaccurate records. But again, this would have to clarify which authorities must report and which records need to be reported. So that's one right there. Number two, a second issue, which I am raising, and I've yet to see it in the news, but it was a bill that was in the past from Senator Ted Cruz and Senator Charles Grassley. That was a bill that was proposed, but again, not passed by Congress. I think it was even filibustered by the Democrats, because like, really? Okay, you may want more, but couldn't you at least take this? Because what it would do is increase criminal prosecutions of felons who try to buy guns. It also would criminalize straw purchases and things like that. And so that's the first issue. But again, Ted Cruz, when he proposed that a number of years ago, pointed out that in that particular year, you had 48,000 felons and fugitives who lied on applications and illegally tried to purchase guns. But we only prosecuted 44 of them. And then one I mentioned when we were talking with Susan, this is something that's made its way through some states, which would be what's called a gun violence restraining order, which would allow a family member or others close to a potential shooter to use the courts to temporarily take away an individual's guns. It obviously needs all sorts of safeguards, but David French in one of his columns points out that this would actually have stopped, or could have stopped, at least 4 of the mass shootings in the last 4 years. And, of course, most importantly, we need to have people who see something say something, because David French in the piece that we posted last week points out that you will look at the San Bernardino shooting, certainly the Sutherland Springs shooting, the Orlando shooting, and a couple of others. There were people that knew there were problems that did not report it, or reported it and it was not acted upon by federal law enforcement or local law enforcement. And so there's another issue as well. So let's, if we can, get back to the phones and take a phone call from California, KNLB. Kathy, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yes, I was wondering, free speech and protected speech. Free speech, you're able to go out there and espouse what you want, but there's a point where it's not protected. Such as like if you do damage to a building or do bodily harm. And since those two things occurred, when does the protected speech end on the internet? Or anybody going out there and say they're going to commit a crime like they say that they were going to do, when does that stop being protected?
And I think by and large, people should be allowed to say just about anything they want on the internet or in a speech, but there are consequences to that speech. So in other words, I, in some respects, don't necessarily want to make that distinction between free speech and protected speech. Yeah, I'm free to say some pretty awful things about a opponent if I'm running in an for office, but that opponent can also sue me for slander or libel if I've been inaccurate in what I've communicated. And likewise, you can certainly say, quote, I wish I could kill the president, but you say that, and guess what? You get investigated instantaneously because there are consequences to the speech. So that's where I would make the distinction. And we are free to do just about anything we want to do in the society that's become almost so libertarian. But when what you want to do, whether in speech or action, threats life, liberty, or property, well, then there's some consequences. So I think you've got a good illustration there in terms of, yes, you have free speech, but you can't deface a building. You cannot do certain things. You cannot threaten bodily harm of individuals. And, of course, the classic is you cannot yell fire in a theater. Even though you're free to do so, there are consequences because you have disrupted the social order. So those are just a couple of quick ways to resolve a discussion, which maybe we should have some time with our legal experts here, Kelly Shackelford and Jeremy Dice. They will be with us, by the way, this Friday. Maybe I'll bring it up then and see what they have to say. Let's take a break, and we'll be talking with Robert Knight right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Often I say on radio that the youngest generation is the most pro-life generation in history. A recent Quinnipiac poll bears this out. It found that 18 to 34-year-olds were more likely than any other age demographic to support a ban on abortions after 20 weeks. As I mentioned in a previous commentary, that is what a bill in Congress would accomplish if it could pass the U.S. Senate. In a recent Washington Post blog, Eugene Scott also argues that this polling illustrates that even after 45 years of legalized abortion because of the Supreme Court decision of Roe v. Wade, the culture battle over abortion is not over. This is surely not what the Abortion Rights Action League or Planned Parenthood expected. They would have expected that a generation growing up where abortion is always legal would want to continue keeping abortion legal. In the 1970s and 1980s, polling showed a significant generation gap. Older voters opposed legalized abortion while younger voters supported abortion rights. That has changed over time. Sonograms have provided a window on the womb, and millennials realize that their parents and their peers have been aborting their fellow classmates and even their possible brothers and sisters. Michael New, writing in the National Review, also has found polling data that illustrates the shift. He says the most compelling evidence comes from the General Social Survey. It asked the same 6 questions on abortion since the early 1970s. They range from whether abortion should be legal for a woman who is raped to whether a married woman should be allowed to get an abortion merely because she does not want more children. Starting around 2000, there is a significant shift in attitude among young adults. They are much more likely to identify with a pro-life position, although they might be a bit more reluctant to identify as pro-life. Nevertheless, this is a remarkable shift in values on the issue of life. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From PureFlix, the biblical story of the last of the Hebrew judges, Samson. Rated PG-13. Samson, now playing. Information at samson.movie.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Just remember, we're going to be talking with our friend Robert Knight. We've posted his article on free money and pigeons, and one that came out today, Taxing America Out of Its Liberties. But one of the other articles, of course, is one that came out by John Fund about keeping the FBI accountable. I've got one leftover call from that. So let's go to Maine real quickly, WSEW. Steve, I think you had a comment about the FBI, so you have the floor.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I mean, in this last terrible incident, there were calls to the FBI. The FBI admittedly dropped the ball. It also seems that some local authorities were contacted, and again, they dropped the ball. And so it just seems like it seems like too obvious, almost like it's intentional. Like I don't know. I hate to sound like conspiracy theorists, but if somebody wants to get their agenda pushed, these terrible incidences are going to get them through. And we all know how important the Second Amendment is. But unfortunately, a lot of very powerful people in our government don't understand it at all.
Right.
So, yeah, that's my point.
Well, you got a good point. And if we had a little more time, I'd pursue that. But since we have our good friend Robert Knight with us, we've got a couple of very good articles that you might want to read by him. He is senior fellow with the American Civil Rights Union and a regular columnist for the Washington Times. We post his columns so often. And Robert, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View. Well, we got Robert. I thought we had Robert there. We'll get Robert here in just a minute. So we'll see if we can find Robert. There he is.
I
I'm sorry, I was on mute.
Okay, well, I thought maybe we made a mistake. Let's, if we can, talk about free money and pigeons. And the reason I wanted to talk about this, Robert, is one of the stations that has been willing to carry us all these years is right there in the Stockton area. So some of our listeners in California, of course, we have listeners all over California, not just in Stockton, probably are familiar with the story about this idea of a universal basic income. But for the rest of our listeners who don't live in California and haven't heard this story, talk a little bit about this, because it does seem to me that you have economic experiment. I think I know how it's going to turn out, but what's happening there in Stockton, California right now?
Well, Stockton's residents are the guinea pigs for a project launched by the Economic Security Project, which is a left-wing think tank that has a lot of the high-tech barons involved with it. And what their goal is to hand out free money and see what happens. And I hope I'm not oversimplifying, Kerby, but that's basically what they're saying. They're going to they say that we're gonna see how that affects people. Of course, I think we know how it affects people, but the mayor, Michael Tubbs, who's a Democrat in Stockton, was asked, don't you think this will discourage people from working if you give them free money? And he said, quote, I think it will make people work better and smarter and harder. And I thought, well, against all evidence that when you hand out free stuff, you get more work and more personal responsibility out of people. The people behind this are really interesting. There's Andy Stern from the SEIU, which is a George Soros-supported left-wing union. Then there's Adam Rubin, who is a high official with MoveOn.org, which is a hardcore left-wing organization. And you also have Chris Hughes, who is a co-founder of Facebook. And according to Fox News, this is really his brainchild, because he and other Silicon Valley cyber barons have been talking, and they think their technology will eliminate many jobs. And so they've come up with this idea that everybody's going to have a universal basic income, regardless of what you do. And so this is an experiment in that direction.
Now, again, let's be helpful to our Stockton listeners here. I'm not sure that tax money is going to this. They're willing to put up their $1 million for this pilot project. But as I understand it, tell me if I'm wrong, a number of families in Stockton will be given $500 a month with no strings attached, as far as I can understand. And they're going to just see, well, what happens when we put an additional $500 in the hands of those individuals because they didn't work for it or anything else? Will that cause them to work harder and smarter, or will that be a disincentive to go out and work? What are your thoughts?
Traditionally, handing people free stuff is a disincentive. I mean, really, I mean, this, I've written often about this, Kerby, the free stuff army that Barack Obama was assembling by trying to get more people hooked on food stamps and all kinds of federal programs. This is a microcosm of that. And you have to understand, Stockton is not in a great economic situation. The city declared bankruptcy in 2012.
Right.
A quarter of the residents are living below the poverty line, and it's a very multicultural city with 45% of the households speaking a language other than English. So it's kind of like it's the way California is going, and it's the way the United States would be going if people on the left have their way, with unlimited immigration, free spending, and no personal responsibility.
Len, again, your column is entitled Free Money and Pigeons. Let's get to the pigeons part, because you're kind of pulling from an experiment. But, of course, that all of the way goes back to B.F. Skinner and behavioral psychology and things like that. But why did you mention pigeons? What's the connection there?
Well, when I was in college at American University studying psychology, one of my courses, we had glass boxes with pigeons in them, and we had a little machine where if the pigeon would peck at the lever, then a pellet would drop. So the pigeons learned to work for their food. And I'm saying that and I brought up B.F. Skinner because we got filled with his theories of behavioral psychology. And I remember reading about his daughter being in a box with a glass pane on it.
Yes.
And, it's not as bad as it sounds and people have made a lot out of it. And I actually went to Snopes.com to see what they thought of it, and they said, oh, it's been exaggerated for effect by conservatives who like to make him out to be a monster. He was trying to find a way to keep her warm without blankets. But nonetheless, she was isolated in there, with a glass pane and on view. So I said, well, it's kind of like the pigeons in a way. But I said there may be something worse than just not working for a living, and that's being watched and studied. And I just remember that Twilight Zone episode in which these people crash land on a planet. This is an earthly crew, and they wake up, and it looks like a nice suburban house. And then they walk into the living room, I guess, and they notice there's a big glass window, and then you see all these aliens staring in at them because they've been put in a zoo for human beings. Twilight Zone was great at reversing things. But I'm not saying that these people of Stockton are quite in that situation, but they're being watched and studied by these researchers who want to form a brave new future for us in which the normal incentives do not operate, where personal responsibility is not a factor, and it's all the system, our place in the system. Whenever you do something macro like this, it usually ends badly.
Well, we have a pretty good idea where it might end, but just from a biblical point of view, before we take a break, work is part of our self-esteem. I think there was even work in the Garden of Eden. Certainly now, of course, because of the fall, we live in a world that has drudgery and boredom. But, even in your column that we're going to get to in just a minute, you quote from 2 Thessalonians 3:10, where here the Apostle Paul says, if anyone will not work, neither shall he eat. And the idea was not those who cannot work. We certainly recognize that we should give something to individuals. Now, I think individuals can do that. Churches can do that. Even if you think the safety net should do that, that's fine for people that cannot work. But when people are actually rewarded for idleness, I think that really goes against what we understand in terms of basic human nature, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's actually hurtful to a person's self-esteem, a person's self-image, but also their spiritual life. God gave us the number of abilities, and we're supposed to use them to His glory, meaning to develop our skills, whatever they are, and to work and to benefit others. If you're a recipient, then you're not in a position to give, and we're supposed to be giving. So that's another reason why we should exert ourselves enough, if only to give and help other people who cannot work. And by the way, I don't think it's compassionate to urge more people to get on welfare, to become dependent on government aid. Some people have no choice because the safety net that the church and private groups used to provide has been usurped by the government. The government has been so busy handing out money since the Great Society that it's taken the role of the church. And one of the top-rated charity in the United States is the Salvation Army. And the reason they're so effective is because, number one, virtually all the money goes to the to their programs, and two, they require people to do work therapy to try to get back on their feet.
Good point. Let's take a break. We've got a lot more to cover with Robert Knight right after this.
From PureFlix comes Samson, the biblical story of the last of the Hebrew judges, from his anointing to betrayal to redemption.
My name is Samson, and you will face the wrath of God.
Samson, rated PG-13. May be inappropriate for children under 13. Now playing. More information is available at samson.movie.
Missing a day of point of view is like Samson losing his hair. Now stay with me. Without his hair, Samson was weak, and ultimately he lost his sight. Without point of view, you miss out on encouraging news, stories of how God is using Christians to make a difference. Instead of being strengthened, you get discouraged. And Point of View helps you see places to get involved, opportunities to apply your God-given gifts for good. Never miss a program, a Viewpoints commentary, an important action item when you download the Point of View radio app, free from Google Play or iTunes. Take out your phone right now and download the Point of View radio app. See the difference you can make.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Robert Knight staying with us a little bit longer. And there is kind of a theme that came together today, and that is in the first hour, we spent some time talking about an out-of-control government and some of the political and constitutional themes and solutions. A lot of that in my new book, Christians and Government, and I mentioned that in the first hour. But in the second hour here, we've already talked a little bit about economics. We're going to get into it a lot more detail now because this new column that just came out today by Robert Knight, Taxing America Out of Its Liberties, relates very much to my new book as well on Christians and economics. And that is, it's tax season, and as we pay our taxes, I think some of you will be shocked at how much you had to pay in taxes. Most people, when you ask them why they pay in taxes, I don't know, it's already taken out of my paycheck. But when then you look at that number when you file your taxes and you go, really? And so one of the things, Robert Knight, that you talk about is that what is happening today, and we'll focus primarily on the federal government, but we could also do this for the state governments as well, is that what the government is doing is both immoral and unconstitutional. Now, sometimes people understand the immoral part because it taxes us so greatly. Sometimes they understand the unconstitutional part if they are a student of the Constitution. But work us way through that. Why is it both immoral and unconstitutional? What's going on?
Well, first, it's immoral because we're loading debt on the backs of our children. And we're warned by the Apostle Paul that children ought not to lay up for their parents, but the parents for the children. He said that in 2 Corinthians 12:14. We're doing the opposite. We're saying, oh, we can spend all we want, and the next generations will have to deal with it. That's an immoral passing of our debt. As far as constitutionality, I think the majority of the federal government's probably unconstitutional, because when the founders wrote the Constitution, they laid out a few specific tasks for the central government and said in the 9th and 10th Amendments, and then no more. The rest belong to the states and the people, respectively. And yet we keep adding responsibilities to the central government, that is the federal government. I like what Joseph Sobran, the late writer, once said.
I'm so glad you quoted him. That was a great piece. Go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, he just summed it up. Anything called a program, quote unquote, is unconstitutional. I mean, if it's a program, it's by definition not in the Constitution, so it's something they dreamed up to spend our tax money on. And it's, but it's gotten so out of control. The other thing that's unconstitutional about the federal government is that so much of the lawmaking is now done by executive agencies.
Right.
They issue rules, and so they're beyond the reach of Congress. Congress is supposed to make our laws. The president is supposed to enforce them as the chief executive. But you have all these federal agencies operating as mini governments on their own, and they issue so many laws nobody can keep up with them. So they've got to be cut back. I do admire what President Trump is doing in that regard. He's saying that for every new regulation, you have to cut 20. It might take now till the next millennium to actually cut it all back, but at least it's a step in the right direction.
Yes. One of the things in my new book, Christians and Economics, I talk about the fact that you have Tax Freedom Day and then you Cost of Government Day. Now, the Tax Freedom Day is where you add up the various taxes that you have to pay, and they're divided into the year. And Tax Freedom Day is not going to happen this month. It's not going to happen next month. It happens actually just about the time a lot of people pay their taxes, in April. But as you point out, that's just the cost of taxes. When you add the regulations, that has been added up before, and that usually ends up in July, which brings me to another great quote that you have in your commentary. You said, one way to think about taxes is to consider that slavery is 100% taxation of someone's labor. So if the government at all levels combined is taking nearly 50% of our earnings, we're half slaves. That's another one of those lines that just jumps out at you because, after all, even the Lord only requires a minimum of 10%, although we're supposed to give beyond the tithe. And here, the federal government and the state governments and all the regulations take 50% of our income, don't they?
Well, that makes them, that puts them in a position of taking more of our time, our talents, and our treasures and applying them to them instead of God. And to me, that's putting them in competition with God, which is one reason the government's grown so big. When they reduced the role of the church in terms of charities and have tried to make the church irrelevant in that regard, and they've stepped in to fill the space, and they've gotten bigger and bigger, and it doesn't work because we go back to that first theme, Kerby, of free money. If nothing's required in return, then it's very tempting to ask for more and expect more. I remember working for a small newspaper publisher in Maryland, my first real job as a journalist, and I became editor of the paper, and I went to the publisher around Thanksgiving, and I said, you know, it'd really be nice, we got a small staff, to give everybody a turkey. And he looked at me and said, you know what, that sounds great, Bob, and you can buy the turkeys next year, because you know what, if I give them turkeys, then next year it's an entitlement. They'll say, hey, where's the turkey?
Where's the turkey?
So, yeah, they won't appreciate it. They'll just consider it part of their pay. So you be careful about what you give people.
Yeah.
I never forgot that.
Yep. I said that to my wife one time when we were walking. I said, you know, I just want you to understand how quickly an entitlement develops. And that is, if I want, as we're walking by each one of these mailboxes, put a $20 bill in each one of these mailboxes, and let's say I only had 5 mailboxes because, you know, $100 would be a lot. And then if next week I put $5 in, after a while, people would be really thrilled. And then the third week, if I forgot to do it, they come out and chew me out. I mean, because after a while, that's what comes with expectation. And so it just is amazing. Let me take one more other point in your column, and that is I did a commentary a while back on Frederick Bastiat, but again, this illustrates that this is not a new phenomenon. This goes back to 1850, in which he wrote a very powerful piece once again about, in that time, France already trying to become a socialist state. And so he has some great wisdom for us today here in the 21st century.
Yeah, he wrote a little pamphlet called The Law, and I would recommend that to everybody. It's Economics 101. It tells you what the government should do and what it shouldn't do, and why there's so much what he calls plundering. Where the government immediately figures out that since it has the power to jail you if you don't pay your taxes, it gets abused almost immediately. So all the way back in 1850, he said this: now that the legislators and do-gooders have so futilely inflicted so many systems upon society, may they finally end where they should have begun. May they reject all systems and try liberty, for liberty is an acknowledgement of faith in God and his works.
Great line.
And he was pitting God, the state against God.
Well, and again, you look at Rousseau and Voltaire and the French Revolution and all of that, you can understand where those ideas come from, can't you?
Yeah, that's true. They during the French Revolution, they invaded the Cathedral of Notre Dame. They crowned a goat, the goddess of reason. People don't realize, when they celebrate Bastille Day, that they think, oh, this is just sort of the same as our July 4th. No, it's not. July 4th was a reclamation of our God-given liberties that the King George was usurping. In France, it was a left-wing overthrow of the monarchy, and it ended in a bloodbath. It's nothing to celebrate, I don't think.
I don't think so either. Just before we go, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments from a case out of Ohio, and this is to attempt to clean up the voter rolls. And it seems pretty common sense. If you haven't voted in the last 6 years and you have ignored or not responded to any of the notices from the Elections Committee, they actually believe that you should be removed from the voter rolls. And you and I have talked about before that we have, 248 counties in this country that have more names on the voter rolls than the total number of people of voting age in those counties. I just mentioned California. 11 of those counties are in the state of California. So isn't this a common sense way to begin to get us back to a realistic set of voter rolls for this next election?
Well, it's not only common sense, it's the law. The motor voter law that Bill Clinton signed back in '93, his first piece of legislation, was supposed to allow more people to go to the polls, but it also has a provision, Section 8, that says authorities have to keep the voter rolls clean. They have to keep them up to date. This is one way to do that. You reach out to people, you send them postcards, which I think the state of Ohio does, and says, are you there? Do you still live here? Are you going to vote? And if nobody responds after a couple of years, by law, you can remove people from the rolls if they haven't voted in 2 elections. And so you have to wait. You can't just do it quickly. The left is out there screaming, oh, this is voter suppression. You're trying to eliminate voters that we like and only allow your voters. But it's nonsense. It applies to everybody across the board.
Sure does. Well, Robert Knight, it's always great to have you on the program. Again, 2 articles, Free Money and Pigeons, Taxing America Out of Its Liberties, and thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Always a pleasure, Kirby. Thanks for having me on. God bless.
We will have you on again. Let's open up the phones for your comments. 1-800-351-1212. Be right back.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Tucked away in the corner of the United States Constitution is an important phrase that demonstrates our country's commitment to religious liberty. Toward the end of the main part of the Constitution, we find Article 6 dealing mostly with debts and the supremacy of treaties, but in the final paragraph, the framers prohibited any, quote, religious test for constitutional officers. Perhaps the most interesting thing about this religious test clause is that it has been entirely self-executing, probably because no religious test has actually been presented to any federal office holder. But the framers had at least 2 concerns about religious tests. First, if permitted, could religious tests be used by religious groups to exclude individuals from other religions? And, equally important, the framers recognized that a religious test could keep good and wise but secular citizens from achieving office. The framers of the Constitution sought a government officially neutral toward religion, one neither hostile toward nor sympathetic of the religious beliefs of its federal officers. Inherently, this recognizes the outer limits of government, that government's job is to govern rather than demand its people practice religion in the manner prescribed by Congress. In this way, somewhat unique in history, the United States became a government that permitted its people to pursue their relationship with the divine without pressure or punishment by their government. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
After a few more minutes, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let me just give you a program note. Travis Weber will be with us tomorrow. He's with the Family Research Council. We're going to be talking about Jimmy Kimmel. He has put on a couple of skits, and Jimmy Kimmel is free to make fun of the president, make fun of you and me, make fun of various incidents, but he's not free to manipulate the facts without at least some consequences. And this latest skit is one that we will talk about in a little bit more detail and maybe give you a little bit more behind the scenes of what takes place. You're free to watch any particular late-night comedian. They just aren't very funny anymore, but that's another story. So we'll spend some time talking with him about that. We'll get into a couple of these other issues that we've raised, and John Whitehead will be with us in the second hour for a while. We're talking about this issue of surveillance, which, by the way, is the latest booklet that we've put out here. As I've mentioned before, if you become a member of our Freedom Club, especially at the $45 level, because we've been doing this broadcast for 45 years, Marlon Maddox first, myself now, at $45 a month, you receive a lot of benefits, the Outlook magazine, a number of other things, but one of those are these booklets, and we've had some on everything from the politicized culture, Sharia law, homosexual theology, making your vote count. The latest one coming out is on surveillance. and privacy. So we'll get into those issues tomorrow with him. Wednesday, of course, will be our Millennial Roundtable. Thursday, I know that Craig Parshall will be with us. He's written a new book, but also we'll talk a little bit about some of the high-tech companies that have engaged in a fair amount of censorship. That is something he did when he was with the National Religious Broadcasters. But let me complete the comment that I made here with Robert Knight. He is one of the experts we go to, along with John Fund, whose column we've posted today, and Hans von Spaskowski. These are individuals that have been watching this issue of voter suppression as well as voter integrity and voter IDs and the rest. And one element of that is that we do not have clean voter rolls. We have 248 counties in this country that have more names on their voter rolls than the total number of people of voting age, at least at that time in the 2016 election. There's a lot of potential for mischief because you can see where that is the case. So this case that went to the Supreme Court was a case out of Ohio, and the state attempts over about a 4-year period to contact voters if they failed to vote. And if they don't respond to any of those notices, then after a 6-year period and no contact with those individuals, they're free, they believe, to remove those names from the voter roll. Now, the argument that's always been made is the National Voter Registration Act, which is called the Motor Voter Law, actually prohibits canceling registrations solely for not voting. Because what is argued sometimes, these plaintiffs in the case say, well, I didn't want to vote because I didn't like either of the candidates. Okay, I understand that. But you also have to recognize that that same law also allows names to be removed from the rolls when a voter does not respond to any of the mailings from the state. So here, this is a long-term process. Over a 6-year period, you have not voted in those 3 elections. And you also have not responded to any card that all you have to do is do anything. Say, yes, I'm still here, mark the card, go to the internet, whatever, to say that you're still there. And so it seems to me that that is a really basic common sense way to begin to clean up the voter rolls. And my argument would be if you disagree with that and you see that as voter suppression, then what would you do if missing 3 consecutive election cycles and ignoring the various mailings from Ohio is not sufficient for removal from the rolls? What should be the standard? And if you have no standard, I like their standard better than your non-standard. So that's at least one point that I thought I might make. Let me conclude by quoting from Jim Garrett. He has a lot of fun here because he says, if your voters were persuaded by bad Russian ads, they were never your voters. He basically says in the first place, he says the Russians' ham-fisted propaganda efforts and what makes people gullible. He goes all the way through defense of FBI Director Christopher Wray, we talked about just a minute ago. And then he ends with a sign that Russian athletes cheat even when it isn't necessary for victory. I don't know if you saw that one, but the hilarious part about that is one of the people involved in curling. Okay, you know what curling is? This is where you're basically playing shuffleboard on the ice. He was found to have actually been part of the doping scandal and so sent home. I don't know that that would help you in curling. And so even when you don't need to cheat, I can see that if you're a skier or a skater or something, curling, well, you can't make this stuff up. But nevertheless, one of the things he's pointing out is now we have been able, because of the work by this investigation that was done by Robert Mueller, to identify what the Russian propaganda efforts were. And they had a couple of phony groups. One was called Heart of Texas. One was called Blacktivist. And they were part of a disinformation campaign. They weren't very successful, to put it mildly. They actually tried to put together a number of these rallies. They then actually had some of these various Facebook ads that came out. This was the part that got so hilarious about this, because they had some of these Facebook ads that nobody ever saw. First of all, a high percentage of these Facebook ads, that is 56% of these Facebook ads that were supposed to be run before the election, they were run after the election. Now, this is definitely the Keystone Cops. This is the group that cannot shoot straight. And roughly of those ads that did run, 25% of the ads were never seen by anyone. You go, wait a minute. I mean, if you pay Facebook to put an ad, then obviously people see it, right? Wrong. Turns out that the advertising auctions are designed so that ads reach people based upon relevance, and certain ads by the Russians didn't reach anyone. And so we can go through the long list of all the things that they tried to do, but I love his line. It's probably the best line of the day. If your voters were persuaded by bad Russian ads, they weren't your voters anyway. And so we now say, this is Russian influence in our elections. I'm not minimizing it because we don't like anyone doing anything to affect elections that are from another country. But this was not exactly the most effective disinformation campaign that you can imagine. They even had rallies where they have rallies on one side, kind of pro-Trump, and rallies on the other side, which were pro-Clinton. And it's like, really? So this is what we found out over the last couple of days. And so, again, Jim Garrity goes into that in some detail. Let me just, before we finish off today, say that if you didn't have a chance to hear the first hour, we had a chance to speak with Robert Brown, who is one of the field directors for the John Birch Society, has a very good piece on the importance of Article 6 in beginning to rein in an out-of-control government. In the second hour today, of course, we've had an opportunity to talk with Robert Knight, free money being given out right now in Stockton, California as an experiment. I think I know how that one's going to turn out. And then also one on taxing America out of its liberties. And, of course, something that Robert Knight and others have been following for some time, the need to have clean voter rolls, which we simply need to have in so many different counties. 248 so far that we've been able to identify, which actually have more people registered to vote on the voter rolls than you have people of voting age in those counties. Obviously, some things need to take place there as well. If you'd like to learn some of the material or find some of the material we've posted on the website, it's available at pointofview.net. You can learn from some of that as well. My Viewpoints commentary today on pro-life millennials, something we'll probably talk about a little bit more on Wednesday in our Millennial Roundtable. And as you go to the website, let me also encourage you to click on that button and donate. As a matter of fact, if you can become a regular donor, you'll receive all sorts of great benefits by joining the Truth Team. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Looking forward to a great broadcast tomorrow. And we'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible.